My name is ZRINKA STAHULJAK. I'm the director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and it is certainly a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon symposium on the early history of Africa, new narratives for a history of connections and brokers. So a few words about why we are gathered this afternoon from my perspective, why I wanted to do this event. It comes, as some of you know, from a great personal research interest on the histories of fixers. So, talking about being in the middle, I do work on middlemen and intermediaries, brokers, go-betweens, and I also then obviously do see the center as being the middleman or the middlewoman or the middle people to help us do research and push it forward. But this research has had me travel across a very wide part of the old world, so across the medieval Mediterranean, but also including North Africa. Now, this personal research interest is not the main reason. It's certainly not the only reason, but it's also not the main reason. As incoming director of CMRS, and after the 56 years of the existence of the center, I thought I wanted to engage in a reflection about the directions that we take. So part of this thinking is now visible actually under our new 5-year, 5-axis research plan that helps structure and I hope diversify, but also unite the multifaceted inquiry of CMRS faculty. We have these 5 research axes. You can find them on our website. They are sustainability, repurposing, fluidity, permanence, bodies performance, communication archive, and conversion mobility. Now, each, though, is open, as you might hear in the names of these axes. We're trying to speak to the times while at the same time doing our traditional work in our traditional areas. Now, two of these axes are pertinent to this afternoon's symposium. One is certainly communication archive because it takes up the foundation of our studies as it considers the question of what makes an archive. And the other one is conversion mobility, which includes research within and across geographical spaces, across faiths and languages, across economies and laws, as people, things, techniques, texts, and ideas travel and change. But what such wide-ranging research orientations also means is that it is my hope as CMRS director that we embrace the world and the diversity of temporalities that we call medieval or early historical. The traditional geographic span that the center has covered can and should be extended to reflect the wide temporal range that we have long claimed under our aegis, from late antiquity to the mid-17th century. Throughout this period, the world was much bigger than Europe. So this symposium is a wonderful opportunity then to reflect critically on several questions. The place of Africa in our still heavily Eurocentered research. The question of periodization when we include the history of Africa. The question of connected history in which Africa is a center to other parts of the world where Europe remains on the margins, as if we were talking about an early history of the global south. The question of what is an archive from which we construct history narratives. And personally, it seemed important to begin my term with the early history of Africa, not the least because part of my appointment is in French and Francophone studies, soon to be European languages and transcultural studies. But this department where Francophonie and post-colonial critique and critical race studies have been central to contemporary questions and interrogations. So the impetus here is to understand the stark historical difference of early history from the colonial period of the 19th century. For it is the 19th century that produced the meta-narrative of the discovery of Africa. If Africa is to be discovered, there needs to be an explorer. The agency would not lie with Africa or Africans. And this is the vision of Africa as the land that still awaits its entry into history in the words of Nicolas Sarkozy, President of the French Republic. French Republic, one of the biggest colonizers of the African continent, who in his 2007 speech in Dakar, in front of his Senegalese audience, claimed that, I quote, "The tragedy of Africa is that the African has not fully entered into history, and that this man never launched himself, this man, African man, never launched himself towards the future. The idea never came to him to get out of this repetition and to invent his own destiny." And if something from 2000 bears repeating, and certainly this quote has been much quoted, it is because in the age of an anti-immigrant, populist, isolationist civilizational discourses, it now seems that it was not an end or an oddity, but a resurgence of something. But unless the discipline of history itself, as much as the disciplines of literary history and art history, are themselves an imperialist tool of colonization and domination, history cannot discriminate in historical hierarchies. This symposium thus posits the early history of Africa as one of interconnected worlds, where Africa was not quite as marginal as Northern Europe was, but Africa was at the core of the world system of commerce and exchange until the 15th century, from the Atlantic Sahel to the coastal areas of the Indian Ocean, and it was a major node of the wider world, to the Far East and into the Atlantic West of the modern period. Now, part of this controlling and domineering narrative of the discovery of Africa has been to tell its history through exceptional, literate figures who traveled far and wrote a lot. Ibn Battuta and Ibn Khaldun in the 14th and early 15th century, Leo Africanus or Hassan al-Wazani al-Fassi in the 16th century. But as a state of exception implies, of course, that there is nothing else of interest. And in great part, that would be the case because there is no written record. That would be a proof of Africa's delayed entry into history. Yet, as we will hear today, the archive as writing is only one part of the story, because writing is the European norm of archive. As François-Xavier Fauvel, our guest of honor, writes, I quote, "If the period between the 18th and the 15th century can be called the golden age of Africa, this is due as much to the tons of gold exported each year from Africa as to the agency of African political and economic elites who, controlling gold fluctuations, succeeded in imposing themselves in foreign markets as powerful and reliable economic partners." Now, this kind of statement demands a reframing of what makes the archive and how to read their sources. Indeed, the work of the scholars gathered here turns the old logic upside down. While some use the same great narratives of these exceptional figures to read them differently, others return to the anonymity of the archive or reframe the archive with oral narratives, neglected sources, a variety of scriptural traditions, material sources. They're circumventing altogether the exceptionalism. And others yet curate a new narrative from existing assets or from disciplinary silences. I am thankful to the Getty curators Brian Keane and Kristen Collins for being here, since the symposium benefits from their current Getty exhibition, Balthazar, a Black African King in Medieval and Renaissance Art. One of the effects of asking the questions that this symposium will ask, at least I hope, that is how the historical narratives of Africa can be written, whether connected history is still anything else but fragmentary history, and whether it thus must acknowledge its own narrative punctures, vacuums, holds, slippages, and assumptions. So one of the effects is that these new narratives, this new writing of history, deeply question Europe. How can an early history of Europe claim anything else than its own fragments? How can it claim a complete historical narrative by virtue of the primacy or the privilege of the written record? From memory to written record is still a far cry from a claim to superiority. In fact, the variety and the fragmentary nature of the sources call for an interrogation of European medieval history as it has been written, and this in at least two ways. First, by questioning the very meaning of literature. Here, the meaning of the term text, by which we indicate written or oral literary content, is not a relic of theory speak of deconstruction, but a serious commitment to acknowledging that the European Middle Ages are stuffed with oral traditions. If there is such variety in manuscript versions that continued for a long time into the age of writing, isn't that also because literature was oral and mnemotechnic in Europe? And second, and here the work of François-Xavier Fauvel is pivotal, archaeology steps in where history of the written record fails. What can European medieval archaeology tell us that will put history into its place? To what extent has Europe overcome the fragmentary nature of its sources merely by the force of a teleological narrative that has, so to speak, papered over the punctures with a written record to establish continuity, and in its wake, the superiority of its civilization? The future of European medieval studies lies in transdisciplinarity as much as it does in methods we can glean from the writing of the early history of Africa to set the historical record straight. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to imply that Africa leads by way of example of oral traditions. No, if early African history can question European medieval history, it is because its sources are mixed, oral and written. Christian and Islamic cultures of Africa left traces before the 16th century, when the written word became the norm imposed by the European newcomers, who claimed near sole ownership of the narrative stole, situation that was predominant even well into the 20th century. Things are changing, and I pick up here on François-Xavier Fauvel's words from his inaugural lecture to the Chair of History and Archaeology of African Worlds at the Collège de France. Africa is not outside of history, but is in many ways ahead of it at their source. So I'm very pleased that today with us we have an exceptional group of scholars who reside right here in Southern California. Two of them have only recently joined UCLA, Lamia Balafresh in the Art History Department and Holia Wendt in History. And alongside them are Getty colleagues that I already mentioned, Brian Keane and Kristen Collins, Gillian Leiden, who is here at the History Department at UCLA, and also Jody Benjamin at UC Riverside. They all together reinforce another of Center's priorities, and that is to showcase the exceptional researchers in the UC system at UCLA and in the wider region of Los Angeles. So thank you all for being here.